Welcome to another episode of Yu-Gi-Oh! Player Ranks. In this series, we rank various Yu-Gi-Oh! Themes based on your comments and suggestions. Come back every tier list Tuesday to see an all-new installment of this series. Alright, what's up guys? Today we have a brand new tier list for Master Duel. So much stuff has happened. We've gotten a new ban list. We've actually gotten two new ban lists since the last time I've updated this tier list. We've also had two packs released. One got released about a month ago, which dropped Runics and the Labyrinth, and then we have a brand new pack coming out tomorrow that will change the game for quite a few different decks, so we can definitely go over that stuff. And then of course, if somebody in the comment section can arrange all of the decks in some sort of an order, put timestamps for it, that would be awesome. There's over 100 decks that we're going to be reviewing today, a ton of decks. And if you like this, of course, subscribe, give it a like, all that great stuff. But let's get started. Let's not waste too much time. So tomorrow they're actually releasing the Therions. Therions are a deck that pure are they're not very good. They are more so engines in the types that they represent. The field spell's pretty good because it can search any Therion monster. The best ones are the Therion King Regulus, and then also another really good Therion monster is a plant one. So those are the only two that really ever saw any meta play in the TCG and the OCG, and that'll probably carry over into Master Duel. But this is one of those decks where I wouldn't recommend playing it pure whatsoever, but it is, don't get it twisted, it's still very, very good in a variety of decks. Like Therion King Regulus is good in machine decks, and it'll basically help all machine decks. If you're playing a machine deck of any kind, you are probably going to be playing this card. If it's Cyber Dragons, Ancient Gears, ABCs, it doesn't matter what you're playing, you got to play him. And then with the plant monster, you can play then basically any plant deck that you want to play. So it's just it's one of those cards where this is more of an engine than a deck. Don't play it pure, but it is very good in the types that it helps. Next we've got ABCs. This is a deck that's getting a huge boost. When Therion King Regulus came out in the TCG before tier limits came out and all of the really, really strong kind of tier 0 decks, this was one of the best decks in the game. ABCs with Therion King Regulus. Yeah, it was a very good deck. I'd say this is probably going to be somewhere around tier 2. The only reason I'm not putting it in tier 1 is just because it relied very heavily on the adventure package, which in Master Duel is pretty heavily hit. I mean, we've got one Water Enchantress, we've got 2 Rite of Aramesir, and then you've got 4 different bricks that you have to play, because you have to play Rite, you have to play Fateful Adventure. Yeah, you have to play Fateful Adventure, you have to play the Griffin, and you have to play the Draco back. So you have to play as many bricks as you do combo starters. So you play, and Foolish Bear, you play 4 combo starters and 3 bricks. It's kind of a very iffy combination. It would have been nice to have seen ABCs at full power a few months ago. Also, we did just get ABC Buster Dragon back to 3, so it would have been nice if all of these things kind of fell into place a few months ago. If we had the Therion King Regulus available and the 3 ABC Buster Dragons in the adventure package, but unfortunately, things have sort of fallen apart for this deck, so it's getting kind of half an engine, but I think it's still going to be very, very, very strong, just because Therion King Regulus is just a free negate, and he basically brings back one of the ABC pieces back to the field, and then you can special summon it from the spawn trap card zone, and you can keep comboing off. It's actually really, really strong in that deck. Next we've got Symphonics. Symphonics is literally, it's perfect for consider building something else. It is ABCs, but not quite as good. The problem with Symphonics is it relied actually quite heavily on Crystron Hacklefibrax, which is now banned. And there are a lot of decks in Yu-Gi-Oh! That could use Crystron Hacklefibrax in their archetype, but because it's banned and because it's been abused by so many different decks, it's sort of like gone and unplayable now. So this deck isn't like completely terrible. So with like a 2-card combo, you can still end on a Vortex Dragon, Odd Eyes Vortex Dragon, a Borloat Savage Dragon, an Appaloosa, and a Snow in the graveyard, Fairy Tale Snow. So it's not like a bad like a bad board. You can still do quite a bit. I'd say the only kind of issue with this deck is again, it's a Pendulum deck. Sometimes they have a little bit of trouble going second, because unlike the Pendulum Magicians that have additional effects when they're popped or when your opponent interrupts them, these don't have those kinds of effects. So if you pop their scales, it kind of wrecks their combos. So I'd say it's probably consider building something else. There are better machine decks than Symphonics, but if you really wanted to like go full power, you could probably turn it into like a rogue deck, but I'd say probably consider building something else. Libromancers is a new deck. It's a ritual. Yeah, it's a ritual combo deck. I'd say it's somewhere in rogue tier. It's not quite as strong as like Drytron, so you could even put this and consider building something else, but I think it has a much more creative playstyle than Drytron ever really did. So I'd say probably somewhere in rogue tier. It's definitely a very interesting deck. Next we've got Runic. Runic is weird because like no one can deny the fact that this deck definitely warped the game. It took so many different spots in the Duelist Cup. I mean, seriously, it took a lot of spots in the Duelist Cup, and out of the top 100, there was a significant amount of Runic players. The problem with this deck is it's a best of one format, and it is so difficult to sort of prepare yourself for this deck. Sometimes you just lose the coin flip and you just lose to this deck. Sometimes you win the coin flip and you still lose to this deck, because if you don't draw Cosmic Cyclone or Twin Twisters or Harpy's Feather Duster, you will not win the duel against this deck. And even sometimes, even if you have that stuff, it's not quite enough. Their field spell is outrageous. The Runic Fountain is a non-once per turn. You can shuffle back Runic cards and then draw cards equal to the amount you shuffle back. I mean, that is just outrageous. They can play every single floodgate in the game. It doesn't impact them negatively in any way. They can play Skill Drain, Rivalry, Goes in Match, There Can Only Be One, a Summon Limit, everything. They can play everything except for Anti-Spell Fragments can be played in this deck. It really is like completely outrageous, like how many floodgates this deck can play, and it doesn't impact their win condition whatsoever, because their whole point is to mill you out. So just based on that, I'd say it's probably like a tier 1 deck. You can make an argument it's a tier 2 deck, but again, like it doesn't matter what deck you go in there playing against them. Sometimes they just win the coin flip and they just start decking you out and negating your cards and blocking your attacks and gaining life points. Like their entire strategy is so different from the rest of Yu-Gi-Oh that even the hand traps don't really work against them. You can ash their field spell, but sometimes you ash their field spell, it stays on the field, they just use it next turn. Like it's not even that much of a drawback. They activate it and you ash it, okay, cool, next turn they just do it anyway. Like it's crazy. This deck is very, very strong. I'd say it's probably up there in tier 1 area. Labyrinth is a tough one. It's either tier 2 or tier 3. Labyrinth is... I'd probably put it in tier 3 for now. It's a trap deck. It's probably the best trap deck in the entire game right now. Unfortunately, again, and this is kind of an issue here, Runic is just flat out the better floodgate deck than this is. This isn't even really a floodgate deck. It relies more on normal spells, but it does gain a lot of advantage. The stove is very good, the clock is very good, Ariana is very good, the Lady Labyrinth is very strong. Like, it has a lot of monsters that interact very well, and then they have, again, since they're playing normal traps, you can search things like Torrential very easily, Compulsory Evacuation Device. The deck has a lot of recursion. The field spell lets you non-targeting destroy a card on the field, which is really good, and it lets you special summon a monster from the deck. The Labyrinth trap card is really good. It's much better than the Eldlich trap card because it basically resets itself every single turn. I mean, that trap card is really, really strong. Yeah, I'd say it's probably somewhere around tier 3. I'd say the only negative part is that, again, it's a trap deck, and sometimes you lose a coin flip and it's very difficult to play out of just going second. Like, your opponent establishes a reasonable board, and even if it's not like that great of a board, they put up a few negates, a few interruptions, it can be tough to play when you're going second, and especially since the deck doesn't really play that many floodgates nor counter traps, because those counter traps and floodgates are the trap cards that actually let you go second, whereas this deck plays more like Torrential and Compulsory Evacuation Device. Still pretty good going second, but sometimes again, it's tough to play those cards through the negates because they can be negated. Next is Ancient Gears. Ancient Gears is probably considered building something else. It might even be a void, because it's just the problem with this deck is, even with Therion King Regulus, which makes the deck significantly better, well, not even significantly better, it does make the deck marginally better, just because the deck has an extra negate. This deck has a lot of built-in problems. Its main searcher Wyvern prevents you from setting any cards. That's already like a huge issue. It's a huge red flag, because it makes it almost impossible to go first. If you play any kind of trap card, you just can't do it. Like, Ancient Gear has built-in archetype trap cards you can't even set. The turn you search them with Wyvern, you literally have to wait a turn. The other thing is, it's very, very resource intensive. Like, one negate can oftentimes just stop this deck. Like, if you summon like the Hound and then you try to fusion summon into Chaos Giant, it requires like 4 materials. They just like imperm that. If they imperm your Hound, now you have to find an alternative way to fuse. So that can be a little bit of a problem. On top of that, the best monster in the entire archetype is Chaos Giant, which is a dark fusion monster. You can banish using your graveyard, which is pretty cool. You can use the Overload fusion, which is pretty cool. But again, the issue with that is it's unaffected by spells and traps, nice, but it's not unaffected by monster effects. And the majority of interruptions in the game of Yu-Gi-Oh! Come in the form of monster effects, not spell and trap cards. This is the type of deck that would have been good in like 2008, 2010, but the game has become so monster focused that literally a Mirror Jade can get rid of your boss monster that you just sank 4 monsters into, and your opponent can get rid of it with any sort of monster interruption whatsoever. And that's kind of the problem with this deck. They definitely need some better boss monsters. Like, their starters aren't even that bad, but their boss monsters are really sort of, they're not worth all of the work that you have to do to put them on the field. Next is Ignisters. Ignisters is probably like a tier 3 deck. This is another deck. It's kind of like it's not like Runic, but it's in the same sphere of Runic, where if they summon the monster that's unaffected by everything, the Link 6 monster, if they summon that onto the field, like, sometimes you just lose. Like, there's nothing you can do about it. It's very tough to out. It's got like 6,000 attack. It summons a token. It pops cards. And if you don't have a card that can get rid of a monster that's 5,000 attack, that's unaffected by everything, sometimes you simply just lose the duel. There's nothing you can do. You just have to scoop. You can't play it out. That card is very good. If this deck goes first and summons that, it's almost like an auto win. But again, the good thing about the difference between this deck and Runic is that this deck needs to set stuff up so you can't interrupt them until they get to their monster that's unaffected by everything. Whereas with Runic, all you can really stop is the fountain. Everything else is basically happening. Next, we've got Dinosaurs. I'd probably say is like a tier 3 deck. You could play it 2 different ways. You can play like the Scrap Raptor combo build going first, or you can play the going second, kind of like Pot of Extravagance or the Pot of Extravagance going second, go into Ultimate Conductor Tyranno, attack everything underneath a Pentastag. You have two different options to play it. There is an inherent problem with going second in Master Duel, just because there are so many decks that are built to go first, full of floodgates, stuff like Runic, stuff like, again, like Labyrinth. Some people do play floodgates in Labyrinth. There is an inherent disadvantage to going second. Also, Max C is really annoying when you're going second. If your opponent set up a board and then end phase, and they end their turn, set up a board, then it's your turn. As soon as you draw a card, they're like Max C. Well, great. Now you can break your opponent's board, but even though you can break their board, every time you special summon, you're also giving them new cards to help them beat you the following turn, and then they can draw into more hand traps, Nibiru, etc. It's kind of a built-in problem with going second. Going first, again, this deck can put up a sizable board. Elazar Logia, it can put up Bankatrops, Borload Savage Dragon. You can definitely put up a decent board going first or second, so I'd probably say somewhere around tier 3. This is Pure Adventure. Pure Adventure is almost unplayable. I've never even seen anybody play Pure Adventure. It's such a disaster. There's just not enough cards to actually play. They did get in the last pack a card called Illegal Knight, which is pretty good, but it's more of a going second adventure card. So I'd say it's probably, and again, the adventure engine is just really, really heavily hit. And that's kind of the biggest issue with Adventure. It's really, really, really hit on the ban list. So it kind of makes it a bit difficult to play. Next, we've got, and I don't mean as an engine. As an engine, it's not dead. You can still play it. But as a pure deck, it's almost unplayable. Next this is Exosisters. Exosister is probably like a rogue deck. The problem with Exosisters is it really depends what metagame you're in. If it's a very graveyard-focused metagame, then Exosisters is very good. But if it's not, then this deck can definitely struggle. Again, this deck does nothing against Runic. This deck does nothing against floowandereeze. This deck does nothing against a lot of the top decks. But against something like ABCs, this deck is very good. Against something like Labyrinth, which does recur from the graveyard a lot, this deck is very good. Stuff like even dinosaurs and Ignisters. Like, it really depends what your deck you're playing against, and that's kind of unfortunate for the deck. It's very dependent on what your opponent is playing. Lightsworns are probably like bottom of rogue. I think soon they're going to consider building something else when tier limits come out, but right now I'd say they're probably like bottom of rogue. Honestly, this is a deck that just really needs support. The best card in the entire archetype is Charge of the Light Brigade and Raiden, and both of them are just kind of slow. Like, the monsters inside of this archetype are very slow, and they need better ways to mill cards at a quicker rate. There are good cards in the archetype like Wolf, like Minerva, stuff like that, but a lot of these cards require setup from other cards, and sometimes getting that first mill like off to the start can be a little bit difficult. But if you can start milling quite fast, it can be good. The good thing about Master Duel is that Grass Looks Greener is at 3. So if you play that, that's always very good. If you can mill 20 cards in Lightsworns, you usually will win the duel. But honestly, if you can mill 20 cards in almost any deck in Yu-Gi-Oh, you will probably win the duel. Even like something bad like Element Sabers. Like, if you mill 20 cards in Element Sabers, you can win. But I mean, that's not saying much, because you can do that in a lot of decks. Next is Raid Raptor. Raid Raptor is probably like at a higher end of Rogue. I've seen Raid Raptor be quite strong when mixed with things like Phantom Knights. You can mix it with Phantom Knights. You can mix it with some of the other generic sort of Wing Beast and Phantom Knight support, because the two archetypes do actually overlap. You can mix it with Black Wings. You can mix it with some of the Samora cards. It can definitely be quite an interesting deck. I don't think it's as good as just playing a pure version of the Phantom Knights. I think it's a lot better, but I think it's still a very strong deck. Next we've got Eldlich. Eldlich is another one. I think it's just a little bit, it's like very close to like the Labyrinth deck. I don't even know which one is better, because technically speaking, Eldlich can play much more Floodgates, but Floodgates, again, they just don't do anything against Runic, so that can be a little bit of an issue. But at the same time, Eldlich actually does have a very easy out to Runic, where they can just activate the Eldlich the Golden Lord in hand, target the field spell, and now you haven't actually placed anything on the field, and your opponent's like forced to react in some way. And none of the Floodgates actually do anything against Eldlich, because Eldlich also plays all of the Floodgates. And then just generally, Eldlich is good because it can main deck almost every single Floodgate in the game without having any real difficulty whatsoever. And the only card that they really ever lost is the Conquistador, and then of course random Floodgates continue to get hit. But what I think what Konami doesn't understand is they're hitting different Floodgates to 2, hitting different Floodgates to like lower levels, but the problem is decks that play Floodgates can just play a variety of Floodgates, so it doesn't matter if you hit individual Floodgates to 2, because they can just, like, if you let's say they hit Skill Drain to 2 in this deck, you just include another Rivalry, and then they hit Rivalry, it's like, okay, now I'm going to include like There Can Only Be One. And it really doesn't matter. Like, you just add more Floodgates to the deck, and they all hurt your opponent, but none of them really hurt you. So that's kind of the strategy there. You have to kind of take a heavier hand to getting rid of Floodgates in Master Duel, just because it is a best of 1 format. Next is Bee Troopers. Bee Troopers is definitely like a rogue deck. Bee Troopers has a huge issue in that the deck isn't like bad. It has a very high combo ceiling. The problem with Bee Troopers is that literally every single card that comes out for this deck is an extender. Everything. Like, there's not, like, they need a boss monster. And they don't need a boss monster with like a 4,000 attack that requires 15 bugs to make. I'm talking about like a boss monster with like a negate, or a boss monster with a non-targeting banish that's a quick effect, like something like a Mirror Jade, something like a Totally Awesome. Like insects need like a good boss monster, like a strong boss monster that both facilitates the arc, something like an Ultimate Conductor Tyranno. Like, I'm not talking about just like a beat stick that actually has negative drawbacks. Like, its boss monster is like unaffected the turn it's summoned, but then it's not unaffected later, but it takes 4 bugs to make. Like I don't know what they were thinking with the, and they randomly just, it was a link based archetype, they just randomly just turned and went, oh no, it's a fusion, it's a fusion monster. Like the design is a little bit weird. They really need a boss monster. They need more interruptions and less extenders. They just announced actually a new support card, which we're probably going to get in Master Duel in 5 to 7 years, but it's just basically another extender on a fusion monster, which is again kind of an issue. Like the deck doesn't need any more extenders. It has great extenders. It has Bee Troopers. It has the it has the Bee Troopers. It has the Battle Wasps. Like it has good extenders. What it needs is actually just good boss monsters to end on, especially since it locks itself into insect monsters. So that's kind of like the issue with the deck. I'd say it's probably the only ever success that I've ever seen it have was back when the entire Phoenix Enforcer engine was totally available. It had a few good wins in the TCG, but other than that, the deck has been sort of a big letdown. It has some good boss monsters like Cicada King, which is a monster negate, and Scary Moth, stuff like that. But again, those just do absolutely nothing against Runic anyway. So if you just have a Runic matchup, you literally lose. Even its like main deck monster, Singer Langer, it banishes a card from your opponent's graveyard. Again, like what is that doing against Runic? That is literally like almost nothing against Runic. It has the Bomber, which is a monster negate, but it's a monster negate on an extender that you are going to link away. So why there's a monster negate on an extender, I don't even understand. You put negates on boss monsters, not on extenders. You're not going to keep it on the board. So yeah, the deck is definitely rogue. It's got a very high ceiling, but the problem is it has like the ceiling is too high for it to ever reach. It has a very high ceiling, but there's nothing on the roof. That's kind of the issue with this deck. There's nothing up there. It's got no boss monsters, no nothing. Goki is, I'd say it's kind of like maybe rogue, consider building something else. It's like a combo deck, but without some of the old warrior support that was available and a lot of the really good Link monsters that were available in Link era that are now banned. Stuff like Nightmare, the Nightmare that gives them 2 normal summons, the Borolo Dragon that lets you discard your opponent's hand. Like all that stuff is banned now, so the deck is just, it can link summon a lot, but it just basically makes a monster that's unaffected, that's like 3,000 attack, and your opponent just attacks over it and you lose. Monarchs is probably like somewhere in like rogue. Monarch is a decent deck. I think it's outclassed by floowandereeze as a tribute summon deck, and I think it's outclassed by True Dracos as a it's outclassed by both of those decks in terms of tribute summoning decks. I think this is the not as great of an option as the other two. This is DDDs. DDDs is probably like a tier 3 deck. I think it's actually quite a strong deck. It's the other Pendulum deck that is still viable. It's a very, very complicated deck to play. It's not, if you're a beginner, this is not the deck I would tell you to play right away. It literally uses every mechanic in the game. Links, pendulums, fusions, everything. It uses everything, and it has a very high skill ceiling. If you're a little bit slow, I would stay away from this deck. I would focus something more on, on Eldlich. If you're a little newer, focus on more of an easy deck to play. This is not the easiest deck. So if you have trouble in school, this is not the deck for you. Next is Familiar Possessed. Avoid at all costs. I really don't like this deck personally, but even my personal hate against this deck aside, this deck is just, it's a worst Altergeist. It's a worst Wind Witch. It's a spellcaster deck full of monsters that do absolutely nothing. Like, they would be better if they were normal monsters, because then they would have synergy with like other cards that have synergy with like normal. Like, I wish they remade these cards and made them all normal monsters, because then the deck would be somewhat playable. It basically is just a giant floodgate fest that plays stuff like Secret Village, stuff like that. Ironically enough, it actually has a really good matchup against one of the best decks in the entire game, which is Runic. Because if you just activate Secret Village, most of the time Runic has absolutely no out. And a lot of the floodgates that Runic play, again, they do nothing against this. They play Rivalry, doesn't matter. They play Skill Drain, again, these effects are worthless anyway, so it doesn't matter. Like, literally, this deck, despite being how bad it is, I'd probably say it's probably better than Pure Adventurer. Despite being how bad it is, it actually has a great matchup against Runic. So if you want to make a Runic players pay, this is definitely the deck. This is Neos. Neos, I think, is a consider building something else. I I put pure heroes, like heroes over here on the list. The problem with this is it's getting new support later down the line, and then Air Neos is just not in the game for completely unexplained reasons. We'll never know why. Air Neos is like locked up in prison, but it's definitely consider building something else. This is definitely avoid at all cost, or consider building something else. It's probably not avoid at all cost. All right, next up we've got Adamancipators. Adamancipators is a tough one to judge because it did win the entire Duelist Cup, but at the same time, like Runic was very fresh, and because Runic was very fresh, playing 60 card decks against Runic was actually quite good because they'd have to banish an additional 20 cards. So Adamancipator did very well. Also, Block Dragon did get hit on the ban list, which again, Block Dragon to 1 does negatively affect the deck, but it only negatively affects the 60 card Grasslix Greener version of the deck. The regular version of the deck isn't even like impacted in any way because they only ever played on Block Dragon. Union Carrier still around, all that stuff is still good. So I'd say it's probably like a tier 2 deck. Tier 1 maybe, but I'd say it's probably like around the tier 2 deck. Even though it did win, it did get hit, but the pure version is still very strong. Next is Crystal Beast, is definitely in consider building something else. There's more support that is around the corner that's actually really good. The deck right now is just a little bit weak. It doesn't really do quite as much. There's a new fusion monster coming out. There's a new continuous spell that gives them an extra normal summon that lets them bounce a card that's coming out, that lets them search. There's a new search card that's coming out. There's a lot of really good stuff that's coming out for Crystal Beast. It's just going to take a matter of time. They might get a random structure deck out of nowhere. I don't know what it's going to be, but the deck is definitely going to get some more support that'll probably make it like a rogue tier deck. But right now I think it's in consider building something else. Next is Tunes. I think Tunes is definitely in consider building something else. This deck, it just has a core issue with the fact that it just is not playable until like the 3rd or 4th turn of the duel. That's just that is built into the deck. That is it's the problem. Like you literally can't attack. You put things on the board, most of the monsters don't do anything. Like, okay, you put Toon Dark Magician on the field, it lets you summon in another Dark Magician card. Great, but that's it. Like it just puts, like, you know, it just summons that monster. The monsters have protection because of the field spell. The field spell lets you banish cards to protect the monsters. Cool. But like other than that protection, they might as well be like normal monsters. They don't do anything on the field except for attack directly. You have things like Blackluster Soldier. Yeah, Blackluster Soldier does get to banish, but only during your turn. It doesn't do anything on your opponent's turn. It doesn't provide any sort of interruption. You put these monsters on the board that do nothing on your opponent's turn, and you have to wait until it's your turn to attack directly, which is kind of an issue. There's only 2 that can attack directly. I think it's just the Dark Magician Girl and the Blackluster Soldier. Honestly, they should make it so all of them can attack directly. And then the deck would maybe be a rogue deck, but it's just not enough of a threat right now where they can attack directly immediately. And you even if you go second and you summon all of the monsters, you still have to wait till turn 4 to actually successfully attack your opponent. Yeah, that's kind of the issue. Good protection, has some good core cards. Toon Table of Contents is the best search card that Yu-Gi-Oh has ever printed. It can search everything in the archetype, including itself. Really good search cards, Toon Bookmark, stuff like that. But again, it's just the monsters just don't do anything on your opponent's turn. Pendulums are probably like a tier 2 deck. It's a very strong deck. We're talking about Pendulum Magicians, of course, not just Pendulums in general. Pendulum Magicians, Endymion, Pendulum Magician, Endymions. That deck is actually quite strong. I'd say it's probably like a tier 2 deck. The only thing is sometimes when you break their board, they can have a little bit of trouble recovering. It is pretty good at recovering as long as you can keep your Pendulum scales on board, because you can always just summon from your Pendulum from the top of your extra deck and kind of go off all over again. But sometimes recursion can be a little bit of an issue with Pendulums, but generally speaking, that deck is quite good. It puts up a lot of negates. It did get hit a little bit just because the Odd Eyes is a card that they got rid of, and Odd Eyes used to allow you to copy Electromite's effect and reuse it if you needed to, stuff like Astrograph, stuff like that. So it was actually quite good. But honestly, Pendulums are probably in a better place in Master Duel than they are in the TCG, just because they have almost everything that they would ever need unlocked. So they actually are a pretty good spot. Next is Heroes. Heroes is probably like a tier 3 deck. It's actually quite good. Absolutely, this is a deck that loses to Nibiru, but nobody's playing Nibiru. Like literally nobody is playing Nibiru. And the deck is, again, pretty good. It banishes, it makes it so every card that leaves the field is banished. Darklaw, of course, is their best end board. Darklaw is very, very strong because any card that leaves the field is banished. And then when your opponent adds, you get to banish a random card in their hand, which again is a very good effect, even against Runics, because if you're playing against Runics, everything's going to get banished, and then it's harder for them to recover their spells, which is quite good. And then you can banish a random card because they do search a lot. So definitely, I think Darklaw is pretty good. Darklaw is good against a lot of different decks in the entire metagame. It's good against Pendulums because everything gets banished. It's good against ABCs because they can't make their Buster Dragon. It's good against all of the graveyard effects of Adamancipators. It's good against every other deck up here. It's good against, like, if everything gets banished, if every card that they attempt to put into play gets banished, that has a very, very good impact on the duelist. Yep, it's just overall very, very strong. Next is Shaddolls. Shaddolls fell off hard. It's probably like bottom of tier 3. It's like a deck that I almost never see anymore. Winda is actually still quite strong, but again, when you have things like floowandereeze in the metagame, and you have things like floowandereeze and runick that don't need to special summon, it literally doesn't matter if they put a Winda on board, because the deck, they never special summoned anyway. Like, it doesn't matter. So those matchups can be just like auto losses, unfortunately, for the deck. And unless you're making more generically good boards, it can be a problem for you. Also, since Despia is one of the better decks in the entire game, Super Poly is very, very common. So most decks have a non-targeting, non-respondable out to this card and to Shaddolls in general, which is a little bit of an issue for them. So I'd say it's probably like at the bottom of tier 3. Next is Blue-Eyes, is definitely like a rogue deck somewhere in here. Yeah, the problem with Blue-Eyes is ever since they lost Crystron, they've been kind of hunting an identity. And one of the larger issues with Blue-Eyes is the combo version, again, has fallen off because Crystron is no longer in the game. The control version, which is actually quite good, continues to be hit with the random floodgates that leave. So Rivalry at 2, Rivalry's at 2 now, Skill Drain is at 2 now. Like, random floodgates keep getting hit, which is a little bit of a problem. And even in the control version of the deck, the very trap focused one, you still sometimes want it to go into the Crystron Hacklefibrax, which again is still gone. The problem with Blue-Eyes, and I'd say the biggest problem with Blue-Eyes, is every single time they make new Blue-Eyes support, it's almost like they're creating a card for a totally new archetype. Like, every card does something completely different. It's like a litter of cats. Everyone's going in a different direction. It's a mess. It's like, it's uncontrollable. That's kind of the problem with it. And a lot of the cards are like sort of like neutered and nerfed. You have like Bingo Machine Go, which searches a card, but your opponent picks at random. It's hard once per turn. It's like such a bad search card. You have so many cards in the archetype that are like so overly protected and like so overly like I guess how they make them overly nerfed on purpose so that it wouldn't be too good. And that's kind of the issue with Blue-Eyes. It really needs like an in-archetype Crystron Hacklefibrax to be like really like a lot better, like in the tier 3 area. Next is Wind-Ups. Wind-Ups is probably like at the top of Rogue. It's a cool deck. You can do almost anything once the Zen Mighties hits the field, and you can basically loop them endlessly and forever. They're actually quite good. Yeah, I'd say it's probably at the top of Rogue deck. It definitely takes a little bit of mastery of the deck, but it's definitely quite a good one. Wind Witches, I'd say consider building something else. Pure Wind Witches is a little bit of a problem. Like, all they really ever are able to do is make like a Crystal Wing, which Crystal Wing is good, but it's like a Crystal Wing that can't be destroyed by card effects, or it's like the Wind Witch Bell, the level 10 monster. Like, those are your options. You can make the big level 10 Wind Witch monster. You can make the Baron de Fleur pretty easily. You can basically make any Wind Synchro fairly easily, but like other than that, that's like literally all the deck does. It just makes like 1 or 2 big Wind Synchros, and although some of them are pretty good, like the Baron de Fleur, and Baron de Fleur is pretty good, and so is the Crystal Wing, especially if they can't be destroyed by card effects. I don't think it's enough to actually do anything. There are better Wind decks to play. Next is Phantasm Spirals. it might even be tier 3, but I think it's probably like a rogue deck, like high-end rogue. This deck is very good because it just, again, it's one of those decks that's just completely different from the rest of the game, and for that reason, it turns off a lot of your opponent's cards. So, like, Imperm does nothing against this deck. Like, literally nothing against this deck. Solemn Strike, any monster negate in the game does nothing against this deck because literally it never activates a single monster effect. It's irrelevant. If your opponent makes, like, they're trying to play around like Nibiru and they make a monster effect, it doesn't matter because you don't have any monster effects regardless. That is one of the real big positives of the deck. Also, the deck can play every single floodgate in the game. It can play There Can Only Be One, it can play Skill Drain, it can play Rivalry, Goes in Match, it can play every single floodgate out there. Also, it can even play floodgates that other decks can't play. So things like Dimensional Shifter, it can play things like Macrocosmos, Dimensional Fissure. It can literally any floodgate you can think of, Summon Limit, any floodgate you can think of, this deck can play, and it will not slow down the deck in any meaningful capacity whatsoever. Also, the Umi cards really benefit this deck, which is awesome, and it actually does have a fairly good matchup against Runic, because its traps can be activated. It's almost similar to Runic in a certain way, because you can activate its traps from the hand, and you can just chain to the Runic Fountain, pop the Runic Fountain, and kill their whole grind game. And every time they try to activate a Runic Fountain, you just simply pop their Runic Fountain. And when they activate a card, you can just search a new trap card, and every single time, just pop all of the cards that you need to. Also, you don't activate any monster effects, so the Runic card that negates monster effects literally does nothing against your entire deck. So it has a good matchup there. Now, at the same time, while this deck does have a lot of good matchups, it also has a lot of bad matchups. So its bad matchups are like, if you play against like Ignisters and they summon the monsters unaffected by everything, there's a 0% chance you're outing that monster. You are losing that duel. Like, it's just not happening. This deck loses to monsters that cannot be destroyed by card effect, monsters that can't be targeted, monsters that are unaffected. Those are the kinds of cards that this deck just flat out loses against. You will just auto lose against those. Your opponent will auto lose against like anything that loses the floodgates, but you will auto lose against anything that is like has like some sort of like protection. But the fortunate thing about this deck is that the games go by very, very fast. You can climb up to Diamond Tier 1 fairly quick with this deck because, again, your games are lasting like 3-4 minutes. You're not going into grind games like you are with Labyrinth and Eldlich, and you're not building a 10-minute board like you are with Adamancipators. The games are going to go by pretty quick. Your opponent's either going to surrender because they ran into 3 floodgates that they can't out, or you're going to surrender because they summoned a monster that's unaffected by everything. So either way, the games go by pretty quick. Next is another probably like either high rogue or tier 3 deck. This is another deck that benefits very much from Monster Gate Reasoning and the Grasslick Screener. Also, Snow is in the game. Like, there's a lot of beneficial things about it. About Infernoids. It's a going second deck, but it's a very strong going second deck. Again, there's an inherent disadvantage to going second in Master Duel because it's the best of 1 format. Your opponent's playing a bunch of like floodgates, and you can't special summon stuff like that. They're playing things like that. So there is an inherent disadvantage to going second, and again, Max C is like a huge issue, and you can't Decatron Max C if they already activated in like standby phase. It's already too late since it's a lingering effect. Next is Subterrors, probably like a bottom of tier 3 control deck. It's another deck that can main deck every single floodgate in the game. One thing that this deck is really lacking is Dragoon. Dragoon absolutely should be in the game. There's no excuse why Dragoon's not in the game. Just because, like, I don't even see Dragoon seeing that much play. Like you can consider what decks would play Dragoon. The amount of bricks that you have to play to make Dragoon usable in your deck is actually way too large. Like, this wouldn't play Dragoon, this would probably not play Dragoon, you wouldn't play Dragoon in this, Pendulums wouldn't play, like, there's a lot of decks here. These two would not play Dragoon. Like, most of the top decks are not playing Dragoon. DDDs are not playing Dragoon, Dinosaurs are not playing Dragoon, Ignisters not playing Dragoon, like, this is not playing Dragoon. Like, most of these decks are not going to be playing Dragoon, even if Dragoon is in the game. So why it's banned and not available, I don't even know. I would say definitely Dragoon is a card that would benefit this. This is probably the best flip deck in the game. It's better than Shaddolls because Not better than Shaddolls. It's better than Shaddolls in terms of the flipping effects. The Shaddol flipping effects rarely come up. But it's actually quite decent, probably tier 3. Spirals are probably somewhere in like the middle of tier 3. It's another deck that's pretty good. It's waiting for Illusion Magician to come out, which again is the last batch of support from Battles of Chaos. So it's like literally the last few cards that you need. Yeah, I don't know why the Dark Magician stuff hasn't dropped, but once that drops, that'll make Magician Souls easier to search. And once Magician Souls is easier to search, you can put Master Plan into the graveyard easier, and this deck becomes much, much stronger. But right now, it's still very good. It's probably somewhere around like tier 3. Very, very good combo deck. Even good going second. Really strong cards to help you pop. Yeah, Master Plan is just a sick card. Next is Batteryman. I'd say Batteryman is probably like consider building something else. Literally, it's just Batteryman is literally just Thunder Dragons, but just worse. It's a worse Thunder Dragon deck. It just doesn't do as much, doesn't have as strong cards. I'd say it's probably somewhere and consider building something else. Adamancipators is absolutely terrible. If you played the chapter in the solo mode, this deck is just a flaming disaster. It is absolutely a mess. A lot of your effects, like the entire point of the deck is to put like these giant monsters onto the board. You gain attack, and then a lot of the effects like will just like, okay, you can't attack this turn, and you have these giant monsters you can't attack. I remember playing the solo mode and like me and the computer couldn't attack for like 8 turns straight because we kept activating effects that locked us out of attacking, which was like one of the dumbest things ever. It's like a beat down deck that can't attack. This deck is a real disaster. Altergeist is probably like a tier 3 deck. It's another kind of like control deck. It's a strong deck, but it's just it's one of those decks that it's been power crept significantly since it's come out. Yeah, tier 3 is probably like a fair place. It can play a lot of good stuff like it can play a lot of things like Secret Village of the Spellcasters, Anti-Spell, and it can do well against like Runick. It can do well against Despia. It can do well against a lot of the very spell-heavy decks that are in the game because, again, you don't need to play... you can play stuff like that, and then your opponent can't play spells, and in a best-of-1 format, that can really, really be bad for them. But those cards are also not good going second, so I'd say probably somewhere around tier 3. It's literally just... It's familiar possessed, but like better. Next is, I'll put this right next to, this is Rogue. I'll put it probably next to Raid Raptors. It has a very similar strategy where they're just basically summoning a bunch of wing beast monsters that are really, really strong, really, really large. There's another batch of support that's coming out that's actually really, really good, and hopefully it comes soon, because I think with that support, this deck probably goes around tier 3. But the issue with the new support is that tier elements will also probably come out at a similar time, and that deck will just kind of wreck everything. Next is, this is Gravekeepers. I think Gravekeepers are right around Exosisters. I think Gravekeepers are actually in certain ways better than Exosisters, because Exosisters are really, really good in a format where your opponent uses the graveyard a lot. But when your opponent doesn't use the graveyard, this deck is like really not that great, especially since they don't have Martha. Whereas this deck is pretty good, is really good in an environment when your opponent uses the graveyard a lot, but it's still actually somewhat playable if your opponent does not use the graveyard. Like even if it's not a graveyard deck, you still have the fusion monster that lets you search, you still have a negate available that's searchable to you. Like it's still a usable deck, but both of them are good in metagames where your opponent uses the graveyard a lot. The graveyard is important in this game, but it's not always important. But Necro Valley actually is very good against the Runic deck, because the Runic field spell basically gets turned off. They can't put their cards back, which is pretty good. FA is a consider building something else. It's a synchro-based archetype that basically like manipulates levels, which is pretty cool, but I think it's just a little too slow, and it takes a little bit too much time to actually get started. The main deck monster, this FA Don Dragster, is actually better in other archetypes than it is in its own archetype. It is a pretty cool spawn trap negate. This is Magical Musketeers. I'd say it's probably somewhere around like the higher, like the middle of Rogue. It's Magical Musketeer Max is a very strong card. It's one of the best link monsters like ever, like one of the best link ones for an archetype that an archetype has ever had. But literally the entire archetype relies around that one card. And this is a deck that every time there's like a random new support card, they get a bunch of new hype and people like buy it out. If there's some like new niche card that comes out and everyone's like super excited about it, but the deck never actually becomes meta ever. It's like, it's crazy. It's just, the problem is it's so normal summon reliant. If your opponent literally just compulsory evacuation devices your first normal summon, you simply lose. There's nothing you can do. And that's kind of the biggest issue of the deck, is if they can just get rid of the first monster that you drop on board, you cannot keep playing. So it's probably somewhere in Rogue. Next is Cyber Angels is consider building something else. There are just better ritual strategies available to you. Even Libromancers that are coming out somewhat soon are better than pure Cyber Angels. And of course, most of the Cyber Angels just end up being used in Drytron anyway. Time Lords, not Time Thieves, I should say, is probably at the higher end of consider building something else. It's an Exceed archetype. I think it's actually kind of decent, but it's just... It doesn't quite do enough in its very purest form. There's been a lot of like mixed versions in the past, like Lunalight Time Thieves and other mixed versions where Time Thieves with something else, and those were actually quite successful over the years. But pure, it can be a little bit underwhelming. I could probably put it like somewhere at the bottom of Rogue, but again, it's just kind of like, it's a tough deck to play pure because it doesn't actually have any like really good boss monsters. Like Time Thief Redoer is a great like end board card if you have a rank 4 deck, because it gives you information on what your opponent's playing. If you get a trap card, you can get rid of an opponent's a card non-targeting. You can let you draw a card, protect itself by banishing itself until the end phase. All of those effects are fairly good. It's just that it's almost like Time Thief Redoer is just better in other archetypes than it is in its own archetype, which is kind of an issue, but it's a decent like rank 4 strategy. This is Dragon Link. I'd say Dragon Link is probably like around tier 2. It's another like sort of, it's a complicated deck to play. It's not an easy one to learn whatsoever. Like, this is one that if you have trouble reading, maybe not the best deck for you. There's a lot to read. There's a lot to learn. Again, it can play around a lot of hand traps. It can play around Nibiru. It can play around like a lot of different things. And even like Chaos Space is really good, even against like Runic, because you can take things out of your banish pile, put them back in the deck, put them at the bottom of the deck, draw a card. Like even against Runic, like you have ways to get your outs back into rotation, which is pretty cool. But the deck is fairly strong. I'd say it's probably somewhere around tier 2. Next is, this is Galaxy Eyes. I think Galaxy Eyes is probably somewhere around here. It can go first, it can go second. It has a very versatile lineup of cards. It can get to Cyber Dragon Infinity. It can get to any like rank 8 if you want to. Yeah, it has a lot of very strong cards. It can get to rank 4s too, which is kind of cool. The deck is just extremely versatile. It can go for link plays. Yeah, the deck is, it just depends what direction you want to go. Quite good going second or going first. It's just, again, the biggest problem with this is that the majority of the monsters are very high level, so it can be prone to bricking in a similar fashion that Blue-Eyes can be prone to bricking. That's kind of the larger issue of that deck. Cyber Dragon is a deck that gets better with the Regulus coming out. Yeah, Cyber Dragon is definitely quite good, especially going second. Again, similar built-in issues with Cyber Dragon is that when you're going second, you get max seed and you must special summon things. You're giving your opponent resources while trying to break their board. So even if you break their board, they're going to have new resources. That's kind of an issue with Master Duel overall, but I'd say it's probably at the top of Rogue. Jinzo is, I would almost say, I'd probably put avoid at all costs. It's a deck that you hope and pray your opponent's playing a trap deck. If they're not playing a trap deck, the deck does almost nothing. Like if your opponent is just playing like Adamancipator, like this deck, like what in the world are you supposed to do with Jinzo against Adamancipator? It literally does nothing. And it has cards that can make your opponent set trap cards into their back row, but if they're not playing any, then there's nothing that you can do. Or if they're playing ones that'll end up helping anyway, like what's the point, you know? That's probably, I'd probably place it somewhere in avoid at all costs. Pure Predaplants, I'd say somewhere in the middle of Rogue. Predaplants are better mixed with some sort of fusion deck, so either Predaplants mixed with Despia, which is quite a decent deck, or Predaplants mixed with the Shaddolls is quite a decent deck. Basically, any Predaplants are essentially, and what they have become larger than anything, is a fusion engine to summon a lot of different other archetypes. But overall, I think they're somewhere in Rogue. They do have some cool cards. Their trap card is actually cool. It lets you summon a ton of tokens. Yeah, it has some really, really cool, like, ideas. It has the counters. Like, it's almost like it's going in too many different directions. Like, it's a fusion archetype, but you got to put tokens on. I mean, you have to put like counters on stuff, and then you're summoning tokens. Like, there's so much going on. It's so many different directions. But a lot of the fusion cards, like Darling Cobra and Orpha Scorpio, that kind of stuff is really cool. The new one, which is the it's not an insect, it's still a plant, but it's a dragonfly. That one's really good. The Pendulum, that allows you to fusion summon. A lot of those cards are very good, and it's just it heads in too many different directions. It almost has like the blue eyes and the red eyes problem, where they just keep going in different directions with the archetype, and it has better synergy in other places than it is in its own archetype. Dragon Maid's probably like, it used to be in a tier 3. I've seen it less and less and less, despite how popular it is. I'd say it's probably somewhere in Rogue. It's like a good deck, but it's just, honestly, I just think Dragon Link is just better. You should just play, like, if you're interested in playing a Dragon deck, just play Dragon Link. And sometimes you'll actually see Dragon Maid players playing a ton of Dragon Link cards as it is. So I would say just go all the way, put your foot on the gas and just go to Dragon Link. As a deck itself, it's actually quite nice. You can play the Dragon Maid Trap that lets you bounce a card your opponent controls. The larger fusion monster that looks, not this fusion monster, the other fusion monster, the one that looks like a dragon. It starts with an SH, I forget the full name. That card negates and then special summons another one from the extra deck, which that effect is actually kind of good. Like, it has a lot of really, really cool effects. It has some good recursion. It has easy setup, which is really nice. It just doesn't do a great deal of a lot. Like, most of the end board will be like, sometimes the fusion monster, Hieratic Seal of Heavenly Spheres, and maybe the trap card. So, like, that is the end board. It's very minimal, but sometimes it's just not enough to get over, like, one of the better decks. Math Mech is probably somewhere in Rogue. It's still waiting for one more card. I forget which name it. I think it's Circular that it's waiting for. But the next Math Mech card that's coming out is outrageously good. Like, really good. Like, it sends for cost and special summons. It's really, really good. And I think when that card comes out, assuming that tier limits don't come out simultaneously, I actually think this goes into, like, tier 2, maybe tier 1 tier. Like, that card is really that good. It really, like, it seriously is. I think it's Circular. It's not Diamond. It is Circular. Circular is the new one. When that card comes out, like, the deck really, really significantly gets better. It's outrageous because if both Foolish Burial is a card and it summons itself, which is just, like, really, really good for the archetype. Dark Magicians is in a really weird place. It's definitely like a rogue deck. I don't think that Dark Magician, here's the weird thing about Dark Magician. Number one, it's missing Dragoon. But, and we've been waiting for the new Dark Magician support for a very, very long time now. It should have come out, honestly, like almost a year ago. And Dark Magician is in a weird place where it's actually better in Master Duel, because Master Duel has more access to easy draw cards, like Upstart Goblin, like Chicken Game, Into the Void, like easy draw cards. So you can stack your deck with the Dark Magician cards, and then you can basically, like Soul Servant, for example, you can stack your deck with Soul Servant and then draw whatever you want off the draw cards. And that's kind of the positive. Also, the OCG has just, like, the deck is very minimal in how many special summons it has to commit, and it's generally better in the Master Duel / OCG environment. But the problem with Dark Magicians is that it's just, number one, it's missing its support, and number two, it's just missing Dragoon. Like, why is Dragoon not in the game? Like I've established before, most of these decks, even if you unban Dragoon, probably wouldn't play Dragoon anyway, because they have better in-archetype monsters regardless. They don't need to play Dragoon. Like, none of these decks up here would have played Dragoon anyway. Like, maybe you can make the argument you could play Red Ice Fusion and Runic and then just, like, summon Dragoon and then just have the Runic card so you have a negate every single turn. Like, you could make that argument. But for the most part, very few decks would risk putting all of the bricks necessary to even play the Dragoon, whereas Dark Magician would definitely want to do that. So I'd say it's probably somewhere in Rogue. I think when the new support is released, I wouldn't be shocked if it was, like, maybe even touching the bottom of tier 3. If Dragoon and the new support came out, I think it could be tier 3. It's a very strong deck. A Morphage, I'm sorry, not a Morphage. This is Aromatherapy. I think is somewhere and consider building something else. There's so many weird random burn cards in Yu-Gi-Oh! And when you randomly weirdly get burned, this deck becomes less and less playable, which is frustrating. So runics have an effect to gain life points. If the entire point of Uro mages is if you have higher life points than your opponent, you get additional effects. The deck becomes significantly more playable if you have more life points. But there are a lot of cards in Yu-Gi-Oh! That just randomly will burn you, or randomly will make your opponent gain life points. And sometimes you don't have access to cards that help you gain life points in aromatherapy or Uro mages, and half your effects get turned off. In a previous metagame, this deck would have been really good. So back in the day, everyone used to play Judgment, Strike, Warning, as many copies of that as possible, and this deck was better for that because generally your opponent had less life points than you did. But now the game has significantly changed, and there's a lot of random stupid burn cards that actually make it more difficult to play this deck, unfortunately. Next is Kawakimaru, who's definitely avoided at all costs. I would not ever want to play this deck pure. This deck, I don't even know if it's kind of like Therion's. It's funny that I put this right here. It's literally in a lot of ways like Therion's. It's an archetype that is both an archetype and works with random types. So like I'm talking there'll be like the rock Kawakimaru cards are really good in Adamancipator because they can give you a spell negate, a trap negate, a monster negate if you wanted to. Kawakimaru Supplier is really good. It's a rock one, and it basically is a free special summon. Like, it has a lot of cool synergy in rock decks, but unfortunately it's not actually good as a full deck of its own because they do a bunch of random things that have nothing to do with each other. But in a pure like rock deck or an Adamancipator deck, it's actually kind of good. So as a pure deck, no, but in Adamancipators, really good. Next is Phantom Knights. Phantom Knights has fallen off a lot. I don't think it's Rogue. It's probably like at the bottom of tier 3. You rarely see this. Ever since Rongo got hit, this deck has just not been the same, like, at all. They used to be like their everything. They used to make Rongo, and then your opponent literally couldn't do a single thing. But now that Rongo's gone, that was like their main win condition. Every time they went first, they went for Rongo, and you had no out. But ever since that card got that card's not out of the game, but Bamboozling Gossip Shadow's out of the game, this deck has fallen off. I think it's still a very good deck, but I don't think it can kind of hang with the big boys up here. So it's probably somewhere around tier 3. Dragoonity is probably like higher end of Rogue. It is Dragon Link, but not as consistent with not as good negates. It's like, imagine you have Dragon Link, but then you have to throw in a bunch of like Wing Beasts and an equipping mechanic into Dragon Link. It's Dragon Link with more steps. But it does give you access to a few cool monsters like Gaydur, which is a non-once per turn card that you can synchro summon, and it's just probably one of the better cards in the entire archetype. I'd say it's probably like at the higher end of Rogue tier. This is a deck that's kind of interesting. In a different metagame, I think that this deck is probably like tier 3. In this metagame, I think it's probably somewhere around like top of Rogue. The problem with this deck is, and if you are a Live Twin player, you know this better than I do, this deck literally loses to every single floodgate in the game. Like, every single floodgate. It loses to Rivalry. It loses to Skill Drain. It loses to Goes in Match. All of your cards you have different attributes, different types. All of your effects are monster effects. All of your outs to everything, to back row, are monster effects. And you can out most back row fairly easily, but you cannot out floodgates. Like, that's the one issue with summon limit kills this deck. Like, literally every floodgate significantly hurts this deck. That's kind of the biggest issue. It is a good deck, especially if you're new to Yu-Gi-Oh! And you're trying to learn combos. This deck is very good for that because it's a very simple combo deck. It's very linear. You will do the same combo every single time. And it basically, off of just one card, usually off of one card, off of any of the little monsters or the search card, you can basically put the red one, the blue one, into the graveyard. You can end on Trouble Sunny. Trouble Sunny will, during your opponent's turn, let you tribute it, summon the other two out, draw a card, pop a card. Every single turn you can do that. During your turn, you can banish the Trouble Sunny, and then you can send a card on the field non-targeting. Like, it's a really, really good engine. You can play a ton of hand traps, but again, the deck struggles against floodgates. And in a best of one format, I've learned in this deck can really struggle in best of one form. If you're going second, you're playing against a skill drain, and you didn't draw a Harpy's Feather Duster, like, it's curtains, it's over. Like, there's nothing that you can do in that situation. That's kind of the biggest issue. Also, Call by the Grave really hurts this deck. If they Call by the Grave that Trouble Sunny, I mean, you're in trouble. There's nothing you can do. If you tribute for cost Trouble Sunny and they Call by the Grave, you don't get your monsters back, and you can't even banish it in the following turn, which is really frustrating. So I'd say it's probably somewhere around Rogue. Burning Abyss is falling off a lot. You almost never see it. I'd say if you want to play Burning Abyss, you might as well just play Phantom Knights. You will still play Burning Abyss cards, but without having to play the risky milling game. But it's still a fun deck. It's like a trap. It's like a trap lightsworn deck almost, but it's fun. But it's much more consistent than lightsworn because it has a lot better like starters. I'd say it's probably somewhere at the higher end of Rogue. Noble Knights is probably another one that's like Ignoble Knights, probably at the higher end of Rogue. It's a good combo deck. It's just it lost some of its key pieces unfortunately before the game even came out. But it's a decent warrior deck. It still has one of the best like Link 2s ever. The Warrior Link 2. Yeah, it's just not quite enough. Next is Zombies. Zombies got a ton of new support in the structure deck. I'd say it's probably somewhere around like tier 3. There's an argument over which direction you should head with your zombie deck. You can make your zombie deck like a zombie synchro deck. You can make your zombie deck a zombie branded deck. You can make your zombie deck a zombie eldlich deck. There's a few different directions that you can take with your zombie deck. It really just depends. The deck can do a lot. If you play Rivalry, literally, if your opponent's playing any sort of monster-based deck, it locks them out of basically any monster in the game. Zombie World has a lot of inherent advantages against a lot of decks, so it can turn Adamancipators into zombie monsters, and it can slow down their deck significantly. It can turn ABCs into zombies in the graveyard and on the field, which can significantly slow them down because they don't have machines and they don't have access to like the gadgets and stuff like that. They don't have access to the monsters. They don't have access to the Exceed and Link monsters that require only machines. They also cannot summon King Therion because if they're not machines in the graveyard, they're zombies instead. They can't even summon that out. So it has a lot of cool like things. It turns all Dragon Link monsters into dragons. All of these fiends become zombies, so now their effect to recur fiends can be out the window. It's really good. Zombie World is really good, and then a lot of the new support has been really good. The biggest issue with this deck is that it lost Crystron Hacklefibrax. If it hadn't lost Crystron Hacklefibrax, I'd probably maybe even put it in tier 2, but without Crystron, this deck can sort of have a little bit of trouble getting started, and that's kind of the biggest issue with the deck. Alright, next up we've got floowandereeze. This deck, a lot of people told me fell off. Like the last time I did my tier list, I put this in tier 1, and then of course we had the ban list where the barrier statue actually got hit. I honestly do think that significantly did impact the deck, because that was one of the things that was really annoying about the deck, that barrier statue. But I can't argue with results, and the deck actually did do well in the Duelist Cup. So I would say it's probably somewhere around tier 2, somewhere around here. Yeah, the deck still does well because M-Pen is still annoying. You still have, the deck can still play Dimension Shifter, which shuts down almost all of the decks up here. Even Runick to a certain degree gets shut down by Dimension Shifter, Macrocosmos, stuff like that. Yeah, the deck is still very good. It's still actually fairly consistent. I know the Achilles heel of this deck is inconsistency, but the deck is actually still quite consistent, just because it does have that quick play extender. It has all of the little birds. It's actually a fairly strong deck. It can deal with a lot of situations, and again, it plays so differently than the rest of the metagame that, like, for example, Max C just will never ever do anything against this deck. Zero. It's literally a dead card in your hand every single time you play it, and as long as that exists, this deck will be somewhat good. Also, it's very good in a best of one format. Next, we've got Trains. Trains is better because of the Therion King Regulus, but it is a going second machine deck, so I think it's probably like at the bottom of tier 3. I think the best way to play machines right now is just to play a full Earth Machine deck, and I will get to that down here. The Machina deck right here, I think I'll just talk about it now. I think this is a good like OTK deck, and the problem with the train deck, there's a lot of cards in the archetype like try to prevent you from attacking, which is a little weird. Like the field spell, it'll be like, for the rest of this turn you can't attack. It's like, why is that on a field spell of a going second deck whose entire objective is to OTK? Like I'm not quite sure why that exists, but this deck is actually kind of good. Yeah, it can get you out of a lot of weird situations. Going second is just really fun. The only issue is, again, like if you get max seed and you're going second, you're just feeding your opponent cards while trying to break their board. Machina slash, this is Earth Machine. So Earth Machine is actually a deck that I think will benefit significantly from Therion King Regulus. So the deck is already fairly good. It's probably, I put it last time I think in tier 3. So for those of you that don't know, the Earth Machine deck is basically a combination of Infinitrack, the Machina cards, train cards, and various Earth Machines that have come out kind of over the years. It's basically a combination of like a few different decks, but it just basically takes all of the best Earth Machine monsters that have ever come out and all of the hard once per turns on all of them, and just plays essentially almost one of each of all of the Earth Machines, and that basically allows you to combo off really well. The deck has one of the best grind games probably in the entire game. I would want to put it at the top of tier 3, maybe even tier 2. And now with Therion King Regulus, it also gives it an Omni Negate, which is really cool. Yeah, the deck is just really strong. There's so much. Double Angle, Knuckler, Ancient Gear cards. Like, I suggest people not play Ancient Gear. I put Ancient Gear where I put it, probably like down here. I suggest that you play this instead. Like, this deck is so much better. You get to use 2 Ancient Gear cards. It's better than 0, right? Yeah, you used to get to use Ancient Gear cards, Infinitrack cards, Machina cards, trains, and Therions. You get to use all of that all in one deck. The deck has insane grind game. And on top of it, now it has an Omni Negate. It has a variety of different interruptions. Really good trap card. The trap card actually helps you play around the Runic because it shuffles back banished machines, which is really cool. Has multiple boss monsters. Awesome recursion. I'd say it's probably like top of tier 3, maybe tier 2. It's definitely a fairly strong deck. Next we've got swordsoul. I think swordsoul is a tier 1 deck. I think it's probably on the lower end of a tier 1 deck at this point, but it's still a very strong deck. Like, it does so much with so few cards. Moyi basically every single time will get you Moyi and a worm will usually get you to a Xiaofang and a Baron de Fleur and a Blackout set. Like, that is a pretty standard board. And then if they start playing some of the Tenyis that have a decent hand, maybe they have Emergence or something like that, they can actually get to some really sick boards. Boxy is a really good card. It can help you shuffle back. Like, the deck has so many awesome like options, and it has a very good resource engine just because it lets you search and draw and burn for 1200 every single turn, which is crazy considering you're just doing effects that you were going to do anyway. It's like you synchro summon 2 boss monsters, and on top of that you get to search plus you get to draw. And then if you use Taya, then you get to send from deck, and you can send like a worm, or you can send a like one of the blackouts, and then you can banish it, get another token. Like, it's a very good deck, especially played with Tenyis. Has amazing synergy with that deck. It's definitely like a tier 1 deck. I think it's better than some of the others. Again, you can make the argument that it should be here. You can make the argument it should be here. But I think just based on tournament results, like, the deck consistently has been topping for months now, almost 6 months now. Since the deck has come out, it's literally topped every single event that we've had. It's almost been playable in every single one of the events. Like we're talking like the Synchro Exceed event, the Anti-Spell event. Like, literally every event, this deck has somehow been playable. It's very good. Next is the Umi control. I think this deck fell off hard. It's probably somewhere in like rogue tier. Last time I put it in tier 3, but the problem with this deck is, like, literally does nothing against Runic. Like, absolutely nothing against Runic. It does nothing against Runic, but it does have good matchup against a lot of different decks. If you play Runic, you basically will lose because there's no like native spell and trap card removal. You have one spell negate, which is the jellyfish. Other than that, you have no way to prevent any of the runic nonsense. Other than that, it does have good matchups. Like, it has good matchups against like Adamancipators. It has good matchups against all these decks, like all of the combo decks over here. It has good matchups. Sometimes you can have a sort of a rough matchup because you do actually have water monsters in swordsoul. So swordsoul can sometimes beat you. Another thing is Marincess runs around sometimes. Like, there's occasionally weird situations where the deck can have really bad matchups, and you can't afford to just have auto lose matchups. I'd say it's probably somewhere like higher rogue, maybe tier 3 depending on how good the pilot is, but I'd say probably higher rogue. It definitely fell off to a large degree. It's still a cool deck though. Sylvan's is a deck I wouldn't recommend playing. It's probably like consider building something else. There is going to be a plant deck that is going to be playable soon. Again, it's kind of like, it's the same thing as like Earth Machines. It's not, the individual plants aren't quite as playable, like individual plant archetypes, but you can combine all of the plant archetypes into one plant deck. So you play a few Sylvans with the Sylvan Link Monster, you play the Aeromage Link Monster, you play the Eureka cards, you play the Sun Avalon cards, you play in one big mashed up, like I guess you could call it like plant link deck, and that deck is actually quite good. That deck is probably somewhere in like tier 3, maybe rogue. Yeah, that's a pretty good deck. But this as a pure deck, again, it's just kind of like, it's too slow for today's meta game. It's kind of like in the same boat as lightsworn. It's just a little too slow to start up. Dinomorphia is probably high rogue. It's a decent deck. It did just get the Rex, which is really good for the deck, because the Rex is basically it can shut your opponent out of the game. The deck does have some like core issues in that it's very good going first, but going second it can really have some trouble. Like, and it does have some very good cards going first. Fert Flames is just an insane card. It can literally out an entire board every single time. It has multiple counter traps that pay half your life points. Like, the concept of the deck is really cool. I probably like very high rogue. Maybe tier 3 again, depending on the pilot. It could be a tier 3 deck, but I'd say it's probably somewhere around like higher rogue. Next we've got Despia. This is still the best deck in the game, by the way, including after the ban list. So the only thing that happened to this deck is Aluber 1-2. And Aluber to 2 does hurt the deck, don't get me wrong. Like, you want 3 Alubers, because Aluber is one of your main combo starters. You have 3 Alubers, and then on top of 3 Alubers you have 3 branded fusions, and then you have Foolish Burial, which banishes the tragedy, and that searches you in Aluber. So you have essentially 7 combo starters. It's pretty good. You can still combo off with like Polymerization and like Fallen of Albaz, stuff like that. The hit is not nothing, but it's not significant enough to reduce the power level of the deck. Even after the ban list, this is still the best deck. You can, if you want a 1-for-1 replacement, almost a 1-for-1, not quite a 1-for-1 replacement, but close to a 1-for-1 replacement for Aluber, you just play Gold Sarcophagus, and then you can just activate Gold Sarcophagus, banish the tragedy, and you can still search Aluber. So it literally replaces it. You can also, there's also a Dragon Knight. I forget his exact name, but he's very similar to Aluber. He's a dragon. You normal summon, discard a card, and then you can search a fusion card, including branded fusion. So you literally could just replace it. I think the card's like probably an SR or a rare. I don't know what it is off the top of my head, but there is another card that you can literally replace Aluber with today if you needed to replace it. So I think the hit will definitely like reduce the power level of the deck, but I don't think it's significant enough to make it not the best deck in the game. It's still the best deck in the game. The only thing that will usurp this deck and make it not quite as good is if they release like sprites or tier limits. That's literally it. Those are the only 2 things that could reduce this deck from being the best deck. Next we've got Thunder Dragons. Thunder Dragons is a tier 3 deck. I said earlier, if you're playing Battery Man, don't play Battery Man, just play Thunder Dragons. It's probably like a higher like tier 3 deck. It does have some decent matchups actually. It's got a decent matchup against Runic, because if your opponent banishes stuff, you actually plus off of that. On top of that, if you have Colossus on board, they can't like search out their field spell, so they can't like Runic Tip get the field spell. They have to out the Thunder Dragon Colossus, and sometimes they don't have the Runic card that negates monster effects. So if they don't have that on board, they essentially lose the duel. So that is actually a pretty good matchup. It does have a good matchup against a lot of different decks. Despia has trouble with Thunder Dragon Colossus. This has trouble with Thunder Dragon Colossus because you can't add. This obviously has trouble with Thunder Dragon Colossus. A lot of these decks have trouble. Oh, this definitely has. What are these? Floowandereeze definitely have trouble with Thunder Dragon. Like a lot of decks randomly have trouble with Thunder Dragon Colossus. It's just not. A lot of the various Chaos cards are kind of gone, like Eclipse Waver and stuff like that. So the deck can be a little bit slow. You can play like a Grassix Greener version, which is kind of cool. Also, Thunder Dragon Colossus at 1, which obviously hurt the deck since day 1. Because if they out that one Thunder Dragon Colossus, all you're really stuck with is like Titan. And Titan does have an interruption, but sometimes he misses timing, so he's a little bit of a weirdo. But yeah, Thunder Dragon Colossus being at 1 is really the only thing that kind of drags down the deck. If it was at 2 or 3, the deck would probably be around here, because you could actually end on a board with 2 Thunder Dragon Colossuses, and then your opponent would obviously have trouble outing it. Next is Invoked. I'm going to put Invoked next to Shaddolls because they're essentially always played in the same deck. And both decks just fell off. Like, Invoked as an engine is just like almost not like you never see Invoked anymore. Like when the game came out, that like first 2 months, like Invoked was everywhere. Like every third match was Invoked. And now it's kind of fallen off because literally the Despia is just a better fusion deck than both these decks. Like, it's a decent engine, normal summon, get invocation, fuse it, link it away, make a Mechaba. Like, it's a 1-card Mechaba, but this deck has a 1-card, this card has a 1-card Mirror Jade, and Mirror Jade does more than Mechaba, because this card, Mirror Jade, is a banish. You get to send Tragedy off the branded fusion, which gets you a Search of Aluber. Aluber gets you get a +1, and then also on top of that, the Mirror Jade will let you send a card to Graveyard, which will give you a Search, and then on top of that, it gets to banish. And if your opponent pops it, then you break their entire board. Like, you get to end phase, pop their entire board. Whereas Mechaba is 1 negate and banish. 1 negate and banish of the card you negated, and you have to discard 4 cost the exact card that they're activating. So it's just not quite as good. This boss monster is just so much better than Invoked Mechaba. Unfortunately, it's kind of fallen off. Next is the Lyrilusk / tri-brigade. This is probably like middle tier 3. It's a decent deck. Again, it's not a bad deck whatsoever. You can even make the arguments probably a little bit higher. Probably somewhere around here. It's still a very strong deck. Simorgh is still in the game. Yes, you can't put the barrier statue on the field, but you can still put Simorgh. You could put Mist Valley Apex Avian, which is a negate. This can go into the Utopic Future pretty easily. The main deck monster, which is the not the main deck, the X-Seed monster with the bird. I forget her exact name. Nightingale. One of the birds. I forget the birds, but it bounces special summon monsters. Like, this deck puts up a lot of interruptions. And then on top of that, of course, you have the entire tri-brigade package, which just activates, summon Shirag, banish non-targeting. Like, the deck is very good, very resilient, combo through a lot of things. Definitely somewhere in the tier 3 area. Still very good. Salamangreats is a good deck. It's probably at the higher end of tier 3. It could possibly be like even a tier 2 deck. But again, it just depends on the kind of meta we're in. It's very good. It's a deck that is a simple combo deck to understand. If you're trying to get into like combo decks, I would recommend this or Evil Twins. Obviously, this is probably a better option just because it has a structure deck and it's overall a better deck. It doesn't die to every single floodgate under the sun. So yeah, probably like around tier 3. Pretty good tier 3 deck and one of the better structure decks. Next is Scareclaw. I'd say Scareclaw, tri-brigade is a good deck. Also Scareclaw with Fur Hires. Like, again, it's one of those things where you mix Beast Warriors together. I'd say it's probably somewhere in like the higher end of Rogue. Decent deck, nothing too elaborate, but definitely can put up some additional interruptions on top of the regular tri-brigade stuff. But tri-brigade can mix with basically any Beast Warrior deck. Sky Strikers is, I think a card just came off the, what's it called? The Kagari went to 2, which is huge for the deck. Because before, if you lost Kagari, you literally, it's like, it was curtains. Like, you had 1 Kagari, and if you screwed that up, you screwed it up. I'd say tier probably like, it's probably like the higher end of tier 3. Sky Strikers is a very good deck because it just has such a good, it's so good at picking apart your opponent's board. And it has such an amazing resource loop. Like, once your opponent, if you and your opponent are both low on resources and you're playing Sky Strikers, you will always win the duel, because almost all of your cards are +1s once you get the 3 spells in graveyard, and because you can play a bunch of board breakers and put your opponent at a disadvantage, and at that point you essentially win the duel. Like literally every single card is a +1. Afterburners, pop a card, pop another card. Engage, obviously, pop a card, draw a card. Not draw, I'm sorry, not pop a search a card, pop a card, and nothing's once per turn, which is just insane. And then also you can put all of the cards back into your back row with multi-roll, which is just crazy. And you can recur everything, obviously, with the monsters. You can send to grave, recur, add at the end phase. Like, the deck has so much, what's the word? It has such a great resource loop, and that's probably the strongest part about the deck. And it's one of the only decks other than Heroes that can still use Phoenix Enforcer, which is really cool. Next is Tritron. This is another deck. Like, again, it topped in the Duelist Cup. It's still a fairly good deck despite getting hit. It's fallen a lot in popularity, but I think it literally fell in popularity because people were just kind of like tired of it. It's still a very strong deck. Like I said, it topped. It took multiple placements in the Duelist Cup in the top 100. Like, the deck is still fairly strong. You still have Cyber Angel Benton. You still have Ava in this. Like, you still have a lot of really, really good resources that you don't in, like, the TCG, for example. So the deck is definitely stronger here than it is, I think, in anywhere else. It's probably tier 3. Again, it's just kind of, Despia just has more resiliency than this deck does. This deck just makes kind of like a good board, but going second can be a little rough sometimes. Utopia is probably like a bottom end rogue deck. Like, it's a decent rogue deck, but it's not like anything crazy. It's one of the better Xyz, like pure Xyz decks. If you're obsessed with playing Xyz, it's probably one of the better options. It has a lot of cool boards that it can make, but again, it's just sometimes making a huge unbreakable board, and yeah, sometimes making a huge unbreakable board isn't enough, because if you lose to a hand trap, it doesn't matter what kind of potential board you can make. But the boards that this deck can make are pretty crazy. You can make like Utopic Draco, you can make that level 12 Utopia, you can make a Hope Harbinger. Like, I've seen some boards with like 5-6 negates. Like, the deck can do a lot of stuff. It's just everything needs to kind of go right. Gladiator Beasts are a cool deck. I'd say it's probably somewhere in Rogue, probably somewhere in the area of like here. It's kind of like a legacy deck. You can mix it with Tri-Brigade. There's some decent combos you could do. You can add like Appaloosa. This dude himself is a negate. I forget his name exactly. He starts with a V. He's a negate. Like, you could put some pretty cool boards onto the field with Gladiator Beasts. And then they've got a fusion monster that's just insane. It lets you cheat out other fusion monsters. Plunder Patrol is another deck. It's probably high end of Rogue. It's a deck you rarely ever see, but if you don't know what this deck does, you will literally lose every single time. All of the ships are really good. The Xyz ship, Pops, like, they all have individual effects that are really, really, really strong. And if, again, it's one of those decks, if you don't read, and unfortunately the timer is really short in this game, if you don't read or you can't read, like, this deck will take advantage of your lack of knowledge in this deck. It's a very, very strong deck. Again, with the right pilot, I could easily see it in tier 3, but it's, as of right now, it's probably placed it somewhere in Rogue. But it's definitely a very good deck to play. Sharks is another deck that's a Rogue deck. It's kind of like a higher end Rogue deck. Again, the Sharks are crazy because they could put like Crooked Cook onto the board, and if you don't have an out, the duel's over. It is. It's just, it's done. There and done. It's like, it's done. And then obviously it can play things like Goes in Match, because they're all water. They're all fish, so you can play things like Rivalry if you wanted to. And then of course it has super easy access to Totally Awesome through Bahamut Shark. It has super easy access to a lot of different, yeah, just it can play a lot of back row. It can play a lot of hand traps because your engine is really small. You just play right hand shark, left hand shark, buzzsaw shark, the bountiful tuna is a little bit iffy because sometimes it gets ashed and your turn's over because you have to normal summon, banish it, and then if it gets ashed, yeah, sometimes you get screwed. A silent angler, like, there's a lot of really, really good cards in this deck. A lot of really good extenders. You don't need a lot to do a lot with this deck, which is really cool. Next is Orcust. Last time I placed Orcust, I think I placed Orcust in tier 3. And everyone, not everyone, but a good majority of the comments were like, did you see the ban list? That's impossible. Orcust is going to be broken. I swear to you, I have not played a single Orcus player yet. Since Galatea went to 2, I have not played any of them. Now I know that the deck is good. I know that it's worthy of tier 3. I don't think people were telling me that it was like tier 2. I underrated it. I don't think I underrated this deck at all. I think it is a tier 3 deck. Galatea to 2 is a big deal, but I think the deck is just not as good as it used to be. The reason it was good before is because you had Nightmare Mermaid, and Nightmare Mermaid was basically any 2 monsters was full Orcus combo. They don't have that anymore. Also, Girsu is, I think, limited still on the ban list, which is just that's just mine. I don't know why. I don't even know why that card is limited on the ban list. That card could go to 3. And this deck could definitely come off the ban list. Give it some additional interruptions. Give it some gas to play with. Next, we've got Unchained. Unchained is, I just lost it. It's a high-end rogue deck. Unchained is good. It has a very good resource loop. Again, not resource loop. It has a very good grind game. It doesn't have a great resource loop. The grind game is insane in this deck because every time something gets popped, you just summon something out and you keep summoning more and more and more and more. And again, this is one of those decks that if you're a good pilot, you could easily take this to deck to Diamond tier 1. Like anything like above Rogue, I could say like anything above like the middle of Rogue and up, you can easily take to Diamond tier 1. You're not going to struggle. I mean, the lower you go, the more you're going to struggle, and the higher you are, the less you're going to struggle. The easiest deck to play probably by far is Runic, but it's this deck, like I said, is it's a very strong deck. A very good resource loop. You can link away your opponent's monsters during your turn and during your opponent's turn, depending on which one you use. And on top of that, like I said, when you lose one of your monsters or one of your monsters get popped, you just summon another one and another one and another one. You can survive battle phase after battle phase. You can play skill drain in the deck if you wanted to. You can play rivalry because you're all fiends. Yeah, there's a lot of different things that you can do. The deck is quite strong. Next is Amazement. Amazement is a trap deck that is... It's probably like bottom rogue. It's like a trap deck, but it's a worse trap deck than Labyrinth. Like significantly worse. Once in a while, it's funny. It's like every few months, it's almost like Konami creates a new normal trap deck, and this is the new normal trap deck that existed from about like I'd say like a year ago, and it just kind of it came out. It saw a little bit of play. There was like not Despia. There was Amazement mixed with Dogmatica. It saw a little bit of play and then it just fell off completely and no one ever played it again. Honestly, Eldlich just kind of remains the king of trap decks because you can just shoehorn in like 8 million floodgates and it literally does nothing against the deck. Like it does nothing negatively in terms of the deck, and you can get rid of your own floodgates whenever you want. You can turn them off by just activating Eldlich in the graveyard. You can turn off if you're like, oh, okay, like this there can only be one is really stopping me from activating other stuff. You just activate Eldlich and Grave and banish, add back to hand, special summon. Like it literally like, whereas this deck is like, it's more of like a normal trap focused deck. So it's kind of like Labyrinth, but it doesn't have the resource game of Labyrinth. So unfortunately it is a rogue deck, but it is a cool deck, and its boss monster is a pretty cool card. But again, it can't hang with the big boy trap decks. Virtual World is probably like, it's tough to grade. It's probably like a tier 3 deck. It's definitely fallen off. So it lost True King. It lost the Adventure Engine. And now it hasn't lost the Adventure Engine, but the Adventure Engine is reduced. So you've got the Adventure Engine, which can sometimes be breaky. The Virtual World Engine is actually quite good. So I'd say it's probably somewhere in tier 3. You can still pump out some insane synchros. Again, not having True King is, hurts the deck. And then not having, of course... you can still make a lot of different like level 9s, rank 9s. Yugioh is still really cool because any card set to graveyard is banished, so it can really hurt your opponent. Ghost Trick is a joke of a deck. I don't even know. It's incredible how much stuff is devoted to Ghost Trick in the store. Like they have like a background, they have sleeves, they have like a dual field, they have. What else do they have? They have a solo mode, dual icon. They have literally everything. They have a mate. Like this deck has everything. I have never played against this deck a single time in all of Master Duel. Like I played against it in the solo mode because they have a chapter and I wanted gems. But like other than that, I've literally never played against this deck in any of the ladder ever. I've never once encountered it. I don't know why. It's almost like there's a group of people somewhere that love it. Konami loves it, and nobody else plays it. Like, nobody cares. I don't get the hype behind this deck. Everyone's always, oh my god, Ghost Trick, I'm so excited. What are you excited about? All you do is flip stuff face down in the battlefield. Like, what is the excitement there? I don't get it. I would avoid it personally, but again, your life is yours to live, not mine. This is Marincess is probably like a tier 3 deck, like lower end tier 3 deck. Still a pretty good deck. It can summon a monster that's unaffected by everything if you have the field spell up. Now it's different, right? So it's not, the monster's unaffected by everything, but it's unaffected by everything, and that is given to it from the field spell. So if you can out the field spell, it's not unaffected anymore. So it's a little bit different than, like, for example, Ignisters, where Ignisters summon a monster that's unaffected by everything. It's just like natively unaffected by everything. And this summons a monster that's unaffected by everything as long as the field spell's on the field. They also put up a negate. They have Marincess Wave. They have a few different cards that are really, really good. You can play a lot of hand traps. It's another kind of very easy combo deck. I would definitely recommend this deck over the Live Twins / Evil Twins, because Live Twins / Evil Twins, again, they die to every floodgate, whereas this does not die to every floodgate. Goes and Match does nothing against this deck. The Rivalry does nothing against this deck. Now, there can only be one. You're in trouble. But, like, some of the floodgates don't really do anything against this deck, and in those cases, this deck is actually quite good. Now we've got tri-brigade. Pure tri-brigade is probably like the absolute bottom of tier 3. I really recommend, if you're playing tri-brigade, to be playing the other tri-brigade deck, which is the birds, wherever I put them, the birds. The bird plus tri-brigade I think is a better deck. Tri-brigade Zoo is still actually kind of good, because you can just make like a 75 material Zeus go second. Like, that's still a pretty good option, but I think definitely bird plus tri-brigade is better than regular tri-brigade. This is Mech Knights. I think Mech Knights is like a rogue deck. It's rogue, but it's like it goes second. It relies on like columns. Again, it's like a going second deck that requires a ton of special summons. If you play in the maxi, you're in trouble. But it's a weird going second deck, because you can't really like out your opponent's board in the same way that you would be able to in other decks. So you can't just, oh, my opponent has a bunch of back row, I'm just gonna like Lightning Storm, I'm gonna like Raigeki. Like, you want your opponent to have some monsters and some spawn trap cards on board, because you want to summon in the columns that they have placed things in. That's what you want to be able to do that, because you can special summon the monsters out based on where your opponent placed things in which columns. So it's a little bit of an issue when you try to, like, if you board wipe your opponent, they don't have anything for you to like special summon your monsters out, and then you can't even OTK them if you want to. So it's a little bit of a weird like going second deck, but I definitely think it's somewhere in like rogue, and you can mix it with invoked if you want to. This is still one of the only ways to play invoked. It's probably somewhere in rogue. Next is Weather Painters. This is another rogue deck. Weather Painters is like a weird one. You can literally main deck so many different floodgates, and it's incredible. You can't main deck Goes and Match, because they're all different attributes from what I remember. But you can main deck Macrocosmos, and you can main deck Dimension Fissure, and you can main deck Skill Drain, because all of the effects are all off of the spell and trap cards, other than like Snow. But most of the effects come off of these spell and trap cards, which is pretty cool. Yeah, the deck is pretty awesome. It's definitely in rogue. It just got a bunch of new support in the last set. I think there wasn't like a bunch of new support. I got a field spell and I got the new monster. It's not like anything like outrageous, but they have like an Omni Negate, a couple interruptions. Yeah, it's a decent deck. You can pretty easily put up a few interruptions. Next we've got Harpies. Harpies is probably like a lower end rogue deck. The problem with Harpies is Barrier Statue was big for the Harpies, and obviously it lost that. There's still a few. Harpies really need some like serious new support. Like, this Synchro Monster was pretty good. The new Dragon was pretty good. But again, the deck like needs like some like surgery. It needs like 3-4 cards. It needs like a it needs like a Despia wave of support. Like, you know, Despia gets like 5 new cards every set. Like, this needs that. Like, it needs like 5-6 new cards. The entire like MO with this deck is just to make rank 4s, and rank 4s, while they are good and the pool is very deep, sometimes it's just not enough. Like, 2 rank 4s is just not enough. Like a Time Thief Redoer and a Baguska, like, it's just not enough to win games. It does have a cool aspect where it's very good at it's very good at dueling against back row decks, because the field spell, literally every time you summon a harpy, you get to pop a card, and that's awesome. It has good matchups against like back row decks, but it's not like back row decks are super duper strong in the meta game right now. So that is pretty cool, the field spells. And then on top of that, you can search like Harpy's Feather Storm, which is a really, really strong card, and you can search like Harpy's Feather Duster. But other than that, like that's the only reason I'm not putting it and consider building something else, because if we're being honest, there are better Wing Beast strategies, and those would be like Raid Raptor, Blackwing are probably the better ones. And Blackwing's getting new support, whereas this is still not getting any support for a while. Naturia is consider building something else, but this is for now. There's going to be a point where there is Naturia Beast coming out at some point. I don't know when, but it's coming out. And when that comes out, I think this will be quite a good deck. Madolche is a tier 3 deck. It consistently like tops tournaments. It's a very good deck. It can do a lot of crazy stuff. It can play D-Shifter. It can play Macro Cosmos if you really wanted to. Goes in match. It can play a lot of the good floodgates. And then on top of that, you really don't need much to do a lot with Madolche, which is really cool. Yeah, really good deck. Probably somewhere around tier 3. This is Mermail / Atlantean, like a water pile deck. I'd probably say it's a water combo pile. It's probably somewhere in Rogue. You almost never see this deck, like literally almost never see this deck. But I'd say it's probably I would estimate it's probably somewhere around Rogue. Yeah, I think a lot of the various there's really no explanation to it. It's just not quite as powerful as some of the other combo decks. Moulin Glacier can still like take cards out of your opponent's hand and stuff, but like again, it's just not quite strong enough. It's probably somewhere in Rogue. Cleave Fort's another like Rogue Pendulum deck, probably somewhere around here. Pretty good, can play under Skill Drain, actually benefits from Skill Drain being on field. Like, it has a really good matchup against Despia, because it can summon towers, and Despia can sometimes have trouble with towers, which is pretty cool. Yeah, probably somewhere around Rogue. Fluffles is somewhere in like middle to high end of Rogue. It's a decent deck. It's a decent going second deck. Going first, it can be a little underwhelming, but going second, it can pretty easily break boards. And again, it's one of those decks. It has a lot of resources, which is really, really awesome. And quite ironically, the card that you always want to ash with this deck is Fright for Patchwork, which is a card that you never ash when Despia activates it. So what's awesome about being a Fluffle player is you activate Fright for Patchwork, and your opponent never ashes it, because they always assume you're playing Despia, and the most important card in your entire deck always goes through. It's awesome. Red Eyes is probably I'll put it next to Red Eyes, Blue Eyes, Dark Magician. Like, these are all three. They're just they don't see a lot of play, although they're popular decks. They're all Red Eyes support has just been all over the place in recent years. All three of these decks have cards in them that are good, but the problem is it's just they'll have 2-3 good cards in them, and then the majority of the archetype sucks. Same thing with Red Eyes. You have Black Metal Dragon, which is a really, really good card. It's so good that Dragon Link plays it. You have Black Metal Dragon, you have Red Eyes Darkness Metal Dragon, and then you have Fang with Chain. You have 3 cards that are really good. And then the rest of the archetype is just all over the place. You have the Gemini monsters, you have burn effects. Red Eyes Fusion locks you into one summon for the rest. That's the only summon you can commit for the rest of the turn. There's so many issues with the archetype, but it does have some strong cards, so it does need if it had 2 or 3 more support cards, I think it could go significantly higher. Artifacts Pure, I would probably put it consider building something else. Don't play Pure Artifacts. It's not really quite good. You can, Lancia your opponent, which can be good, or you can Lancia your opponent can be good, but I wouldn't recommend playing that. Cosmos is a mid to high end rogue deck. They're probably middle rogue deck. It's pretty good. It has a cool it's really cool. It's all based on Star Wars. It's actually really fun. You summon the big ships, they can't be targeted, which is nice, but again, targeting that was such a 2016 building thing. 2016 targeting was a huge deal, right? Because Zodiac Trident couldn't target your Cosmo ships, the big Cosmo ships. Unfortunately, targeting isn't even that big of a deal. Again, most of these higher end decks will have non-targeting removals, so your ships that can't be targeted really don't mean anything, and then they're just going to get banished or sent back to the main deck. Like, something's always going to happen, and that's kind of why the deck is where it is. Speedroids is probably one of the better like wind decks. I think instead of playing Wind Witches, you should play Speedroids. Instead of playing Harpies, you should play Speedroids. It's just a better wind deck. Yeah, it has good combo potential. It just everything locks you into winds, and then you're stuck basically summoning Crystal Wing, Baron de Fleur, stuff like that, which isn't bad, but you're kind of locked under certain monsters, and it kind of becomes like the Synchron problem. This I wouldn't recommend playing. It's pure ritual Blackluster Soldier deck. It's just not quite strong enough. They're just better ritual decks. Same thing with like, it's in the same boat as a ritual Cyber Angels. It's just like, it's a cool concept, and a lot of the cards are really cool. But there's actually a new card that's coming out for this deck that's actually really good. We don't know when it's coming out because I don't think it's even come out of the TCG yet. This is another consider building something else. This is pure Shiranui. I've never successfully seen anybody run a pure Shiranui deck. Like, since its release, it's got new support, everything. Like, support with everything considered, I have never seen anyone successfully run this deck before, pure, ever. Now, you can play a lot of the Shiranui cards in Zombie World. That you can do, and that's not an issue. You can, yeah, like I said, you can play Shiranui Solitary, Shiranui Swallow Slash, Shiranui Spirit Master. You can play all those cards in this deck, and it becomes the same kind of like concept as like this, and the same concept as this, where you're just picking a bunch of cards that are good that are also zombies and playing them in one deck rather than playing the actual archetype. The actual archetype, the problem with it is it has a lot of trouble putting zombies or putting the Shiranui monsters into the graveyard. Like, if you can get 10 Shiranui monsters into the graveyard, you'll probably win that duel, but the problem is, how do you get them there? And yeah, that's kind of like the biggest issue of the deck. Next is, this is a bad one. I'd probably put avoid at all costs. This is Roids. Roids are horrific. They've never been good. Like, not even for a split second. There's never been a Roid card that has had any impact, except for maybe Drill Roid for like a split second, like 2006. But Roids have never been good. Even King Regulus couldn't save this deck. It is just that much of a disaster. It does literally nothing. Like, it's not good going second. It doesn't do anything going first. Like, what's great is you could play all of these decks against each other, all these bad ones. You'd probably have a pretty fun duel. Like, if you played this against like Familiar Possessed, you'd be going toe to toe. But you definitely don't want to play like Speed. You don't want to play Roids against like Despia. I just don't see anybody winning that ever. So it definitely would have avoided at all costs. There's another avoid at all costs. It's Magician Girls. Magician Girls literally rely on your opponent not reading your cards and attacking into your monsters, and then you activating the effects of those monsters. So if your opponent's a complete moron, then they will attack into you, and you can summon out like 3-4 Dark Magician Girls from hand, which, okay, nice, you got a stupid opponent. But if your opponent's just smart enough to just like destroy that first Dark Magician Girl, or like pop that first Dark Magician Girl, or send them back to the deck, or send it back to hand, or banish it, like, your entire strategy goes out the window. It's a deck that's almost designed in such a goofy fashion, and the only one that's actually good is like Chocolate Magician Girl, but like all of the other ones are just terrible. True Dracos is like probably somewhere up here. I think it's a better tribute deck than Monarchs, just because it can play way more Floodgates, but again, it's probably like middle of Rogue. Buster Blader is probably like bottom of Rogue. If you're playing against a Dragon deck, this becomes a tier 0 deck, but if you're playing against anybody else, it's just like okay. Again, you can play this with Dogmatica, but Nadir Servant really needs to go to 3 to make this deck a lot better, because then you can actually search like Dogmatica, Ecclesia, and then you can get the trap cards you need into the graveyard, which can help you play the deck efficiently. Digital Bugs is, I'd say it's probably like a consider building something else. It's a flip, it's not even a flip effect based deck, it's more of a flip based deck. So when you change battle positions, you get to do cool stuff. I think this archetype is actually kind of cool. It's actually, what's nice about this archetype is it's a very like budget archetype, but like you don't get very far with the budget. Yeah, it's like the budget doesn't take you anywhere. Whereas if you really want to flip your cards up and down, probably Guru is probably a better deck for you to play than this. But it's a cool concept, and I've always wanted to play it. And I've played it in the story mode, in the solo mode, and it was fun. But as a pure deck, it's kind of a mess. Paleozoic / Paleozoic Frogs, probably like a rogue deck. This deck really suffers from Totally Awesome being limited to 1. Totally Awesome should have been at 3 this entire time that this game has existed. Totally Awesome should have been at 3. It would not have been a problem. If Totally Awesome's at 3, I swear to you, this deck goes right here. That's it. Like, this deck is not that good with Totally Awesome at 3. The deck is better, but it's not that good. You can play this deck in... You can mix this deck with, like, Grass Looks Greener, which is pretty cool. But again, this deck is, like... It's just not that strong of a deck. Unfortunately, as much as I like it, it's just not that powerful. And it loses to a lot of stuff. A lot of the trap cards, like 1-for-1 trades, and you have to wait till, like... You get a decent amount of them in the graveyard so you can actually like combo off. You can never make more than 1 Totally Awesome, which sucks. If your opponent called by the graves Totally Awesome, you just like your boss monster's out and there's nothing you can do about it. You literally, it almost loses you the duel, which is really frustrating. Totally Awesome, unfortunately, when sprites come out, will probably be banned, which is really unfortunate because this entire time, like I said, it should have been at 3 so that people could actually have been able to use it, because it's not that broken of a card, it's just broken in sprites. So really unfortunate situation there. Luna, this is not Fairy Tales, the deck. This is actually there's a deck called 8 Axis, which is basically a rank 8 deck. The entire point is to drop a bunch of really strong level 8s, make Draglubion and just attack your opponent. You also play Fairy Tale Luna, which is quite good. It's one of the better going second decks in the entire game. Like, it's probably like this, Numerons are probably some of the better going second decks. I'd probably say it's somewhere in like higher tier 3. Like, this deck can basically beat everyone because it can play like Alpha, King of All Beasts. It can play Gizmek Orochi. It can play, like, basically all of the really strong rank 8s, all of the really good going second cards, Lightning Storm, Harpy's Feather Duster, Raigeki. Like, you can play all of them. Your entire point is to just clear your opponent's board. Fairy Tale Luna is also a very good card. Normal summon, search another Fairy Tale Luna, and then you get to bounce a card your opponent controls, and if they don't send another one to the graveyard, then you get to bounce it, which is really cool. And then on top of that, you've got the Dangers, which are all like 3000 attack, level 8. Like, the deck is very, 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 very strong. The entire point, like I said, is to break your opponent's board, like get rid of their monsters, and then attack them once for like 9000 with Draglubion. And yeah, the deck has a very high success rate. It's a very strong deck. Exodia is avoid at all costs. If you're trying to beat your opponent in an alternative win condition, just play Runic. It's just better. Like, this I'm sorry, it is. Like, Exodia is a mess. It's only good going first, and it's only okay going first. It's not even good going first. It's very rarely will your opponent ever pull it off. If you get hand trapped, you almost always lose. If you get ashed, or if your library statue gets effect veilered or impermed, you literally just lose the duel, which is really frustrating. Exodia is one of those things that it just needs more support cards. I think since the beginning, Exodia was in the very, very first episode of Yu-Gi-Oh! It's been out for 25 years, and I think that it has less than 10 cards. Like, honestly, I think it has less than 10 support cards, which is almost insane. It really is almost insane. To have 10 cards when the archetype is 25 years old. Next is Spellbook. Spellbooks is a decent rogue deck. Again, it's one of those things where I think 100% Nadir Servant should go to 3, and this deck gets better. I think this deck is really, this is a really, really cool deck that I was actually coming up with, which is like a Spellbook Dogmatica going second deck with, I forget the card's name, but there's like a card that came out recently that sends a card from your extra deck and then shuffles that same card into your opponent's extra deck, which is really cool. You can send like the Albas fusion monster, stuff like that. It's a really cool concept that I had, but again, Nadir Servant is just that 1 in the Master Duel, which absolutely makes no sense, and it should definitely go to 3, and that kind of hinders the deck. But the deck itself, going first, it can put like Jaugen, the Spiritualist, onto the field, but it's just honestly not enough. If that thing gets imperm, your entire plan goes down the drain. But overall, I think it's like a rogue deck. Crusadia, pure Crusadia is like usually a going second deck. Since Crystron got hits, it's probably somewhere in like mid-rogue. Nothing too crazy. Again, it's going second. It can OTK essentially any deck. Going first, it used to be a really, really good engine to get to Crystron Heckle Fibrex, but since that's been banned, the game has changed a little bit. Prank Kids have fallen off to a certain degree since Meow Meow went to 1. I'd say it's probably in like tier 3. So Meow Meow went to 1 and the adventure package got like shrunken. So I'd say it's probably somewhere in like bottom half of tier 3. Still a very good deck. If your opponent doesn't know, like everyone kind of knows what Prank Kids do by this point. But yeah, it's still a pretty strong deck. If they don't stop that first normal summon, you're going on a little bit of a tirade, and you will usually win that duel. That's probably somewhere around tier 3. Pure Zodiacs I'll put probably somewhere around like Tri-Brigade. It's somewhere in this area where you can still like play a bunch of hand traps, play the Zodiacs, and then just go into Zeus, and that's usually enough to win against a lot of decks. Endymion is a very good deck. It's probably one of the it's I think one of the better ways to play Pendulums. Probably like around tier 2. Yeah, just one of the better ways. You can put up a lot of negates. All of the cards are like, it's like every time you read an Endymion card, your IQ goes up like 3 points. It's like the cards are all like 15 paragraphs long. No one has time to read your cards because straight up the timer just starts counting down. You start stressing. If those 300 seconds, if you blow it, you won't be able to play on your turn. Yeah, sometimes you'll be playing this deck, and I swear to you, you will just time your opponent out because they'll be reading your cards and they can't keep up. Dream Mirrors is between consider something else and avoid at all costs. Probably a consider something else. It's a cool like light and dark strategy that relies around a bunch of field spells, and you keep swapping out the field spells, putting the field spells on both your field, your opponent's field, with the trap card, which is really cool. It has a new monster that came out that is actually really, really, really strong. But unfortunately, it's just not enough because the entire archetype just requires so much setup, and most of the cards don't do anything. I think they have like in the entire deck, I think they have like 1 negate, and that's it. That's the entire archetype. And if they pop your field spells, you literally cannot play. The deck does nothing without a field spell on board. So it's probably in a consider building something else category. Last deck is Traptricks. I think this is going first one of the best decks in the entire game. It's probably somewhere in like Rogue. It was very good in the anti-spell festival, but since then, I'd say probably if you're just playing it just in the ladder, if you're going first, you probably will win the duel. If you can summon Sarah, you usually will win the duel because Sarah is an insane link monster. But the only issue with this deck is, again, going second can be a little troublesome. The problem with the trap hole cards is that they require your opponent to like summon out a monster or do something, and then you can chain the card in response. But if your opponent already went first and set up a full board, it's almost like it has the same problem as Torrential, where your opponent already has a board, so they don't have to, like, your cards require them to summon stuff, but they've already made a board, and now you have all of these cards that like prevent summons or banish the monster that's summoned or flip the monster face down permanently, and they're not summoning because they already have their board and just end their battle phase and attack over Sarah, and that can be a little bit of a problem for the deck. Yeah, I'd say it's probably like the top half of Rogue, and these two are repeats. I think that is everything. If there's any deck that I forgot, please let me know in the comment section down below, and thank you so much for watching.